How many people have seen a monarch this season? I saw one today. I was very excited. I was out hiking behind the middle school, and a monarch flew by. All right, let me just test the waters here. Male or female monarch on the screen? Okay, behind the crazy lady. Male. Okay, and so what did you use to identify that this was a male? It has what? Oh, it has balls. Oh, I've never heard, I can't use that one with my students. That'll just like explode things. So yes, it has these little scent glands here on the hind wings. And so the females do not have those two little black dots. And so it is a species that's sexually dimorphic, which means that the males and the females don't exactly look alike. It's not as, say, as conspicuous a difference as, say, between our female cardinals and our male cardinals. But that is one trait that you can use on the wing to identify a monarch butterfly. And so monarchs captivate everybody, right? They're these bright orange, conspicuous butterflies, and we're going to talk about why they're conspicuous in a little bit. When we think about the different stages or what their life cycle might look like, these are all of the things that we get to experience here in Massachusetts, except for this last one. So I actually saw on INAT that there have been some eggs already laid in Massachusetts, so we are at the start of breeding season, and so those eggs are quite small. From those eggs hatch the caterpillars, as was alluded to, and I'm going to talk a little bit about in just a minute. I'm really more interested in caterpillars than adult butterflies or adult Lepidoptera, and part of that comes from the fact that I'm a lazy biologist, and what I mean by a lazy biologist is when I was in my PhD program, right, the whole goal of a PhD is trying to figure out how do you get out once you get in, right? That seems to be like how we all function, and what I quickly discovered was I was interested in all these evolutionary questions about how species protect themselves from being eaten. And it occurred to me that if you study caterpillars versus the adult butterflies, that you remove this like one huge confounding factor for why an organism looks the way it does. And it's because adults have sex and juveniles don't, right? And so caterpillars, the way they look is determined basically by the selective pressures that act on them in terms of avoiding being eaten and avoiding detection. Whereas when you talk about adults, right, they're bright, they're conspicuous, but are they bright and conspicuous because they're trying to attract somebody else, or because they're trying to send a message to a potential predator, or what's the deal? And so for me, it was all about the caterpillars. Okay, today I will promise you I will talk about some butterflies. Please interrupt. So they lay their eggs exclusively, except for one exception, on milkweed plants. Yeah, so we're going to talk about milkweed and some of those ovipositing preferences. And so ovipositing is just the fancy word for females laying their eggs on different types of plants. And how about this? They successfully lay their eggs on milkweed plants. They do attempt to lay their eggs on other things, and a gravid female, you can force her to lay her eggs on just about anything. I don't advise that, but gravid females will do what all gravid females will do, and they will have a baby just about anywhere, right? So we can look across these life stages. So we have the egg, we have the caterpillar, we have the pupa, we have the adult. We have migration as one of these phenophases, and phenophases is just the term that we use to describe these different life cycle events. And then at the end, we have overwintering. And so we'll talk a little bit today about what the title alluded to, that these are Massachusetts summer residents, and that means that they're somewhere else during other parts of the year. So they are one of, I believe, 3 species of butterflies that we have here in Massachusetts that are migratory. All of the other butterflies that we have overwinter with us in some way, shape, or form. It might be as an egg, or a caterpillar, or as a pupa, or if you're a mourning cloak, they're super brave and they overwinter as an adult butterfly, which is really a challenge. Yep. Sure. So the question was, does anybody mark them to see if they come back? And so hold that question until I do the generations thing. And so we'll talk about the generations thing. And that could be on the next slide, or it could be 5 slides from now, because I'm not quite sure where I put it, but let's see. All right, it's in a little bit. Here's another way to just think about some of these life cycle events. And I'll just allude to this a little bit here, that when we think about a monarch butterfly, those adult butterflies that you and I interact with now, they're adult butterflies for about 2 to 3 weeks, okay? And when we talk about the eggs that are being laid right now in Massachusetts, they're an egg for maybe a week to maybe 2 weeks, depending on how hot it gets, because temperature affects how quickly the things inside the egg will develop. And then there'll be a caterpillar for anywhere from, say, 3 to 4 weeks, and then they'll go into a chrysalis. The chrysalis is the one that always has eluded me in terms of like exactly how long they're in a chrysalis, but let's say at least a few days to a week and a half, and then they'll be an adult for 2 to 3 weeks. So this summer life cycle can be about 2, maybe 3 months tops, okay? And that's important because we're talking about, remember I just said that they're not with us all the time? And so that's where this idea of many generations starts to come into play. But I want to back this up a little bit because I told you that I was really interested in the ways to be a caterpillar. So I thought I'd give you a bit of the backstory as to like how I got to monarch caterpillars and then how I got to monarchs. And so as a graduate student, I was really interested in this question of the ways to be a caterpillar, right? And so if you go out and you survey the forest, actually this is also a great photo because when I was up behind the middle school, I actually saw a copper underwing on it wasn't on this kind of oak, it was on a white oak. And I don't think I've seen a copper underwing caterpillar in like 20 years. And there was one of these little guys and he was just hanging out in that same exact posture. They like to hang out on the underside of leaves. And if you go looking for caterpillars, what you start to see is that caterpillars, A, are everywhere, and B, they have all of these different strategies for how they survive. So these little green caterpillars are one way to be a caterpillar. We have some big honking caterpillars, as I call them, here in Massachusetts, and this is a Cecropia moth caterpillar. And so you can see this caterpillar here is actually being attacked by this wasp, and in response to being attacked by this wasp, it seems to be secreting some sort of liquid in the hopes that this vespid wasp will not attack this caterpillar. And so you can see this is on a cherry. And when I say this is a big honking caterpillar, you're talking about something that's like the thickness of your thumb and probably like 3 inches long. And the only reason that I found this caterpillar the day that I was out in the field was it was clicking. It was making these large snapping noises trying to discourage this vespid wasp. And I stood there and I was like, what is making that noise? Like it was like almost what, now with like a fidget spinner or those little poppers that kids play with. It was that kind of like plasticky noise. And I was by myself in the middle of the woods and I was like, what is clicking? And it was this Cecropia moth caterpillar trying to avoid being eaten by that vespid wasp. But when we think about the different ways to be a caterpillar, there's lots of different ways. And when I was thinking about this question, I kind of put them into these 2 buckets. You can be cryptic, and cryptic can be you're green and you match, and so the strategy in terms of predators is to avoid being detected, right? You match your background, you kind of fly under the radar. It's like what many students who sit in the back row, that's right, I'm looking at everybody in the back row right now, tries to do when they're in school, right? They're flying under the radar. And we can see 2 strategies here. Here's our copper underwing again. And then if you look over here, there's a little geometrid caterpillar. And this is what I would call is a twig mimicking caterpillar. And it's actually like standing at attention on that branch. And so one way to think about it is crypsis. Another way to think about it is it's also mimicking something that's inedible, right? So it looks like a branch. So it's not that it blends in with a branch, but it looks like a branch, and birds don't eat branches, in theory, right? So those are 2 different ways to kind of avoid being detected. There's lots of caterpillars, though, that take a different strategy, and we tend to refer to that as aposematism. And aposematism is where organisms have this bright, conspicuous coloration, and that coloration communicates something. Okay, so just like my attire communicates something to you. Trust me, I had jeans on, and then I turned and went back up the stairs, and my husband goes, "Are you changing?" And I was like, "I am." And he's like, "What happened?" And I was like, "I decided I should be more professional tonight." Right, and so it communicates something. I did put on my crazy shirt though, my crazy professor shirt. So it communicates something to the potential predator, and in the case of aposematism, it sends an honest signal. And so what I mean by an honest signal is it says, "Hello, look at me," right? I'm a professional, right? So hopefully I sent an honest signal. You can decide by the end of my talk if I've actually sent an honest signal or not. But hopefully I've sent an honest signal. Professional attire, professional talk. You guys, my jokes aren't really landing with you just yet. It's a different age bracket than I'm used to, so we'll see. But it's sending a signal. And in the case of these aposematic organisms, that means that there's something unpalatable about them. So the giveaway with our monarch, right? What's the takeaway with our monarch? We're going for the interactive audience moment. Why are monarchs aposematic? Are they edible? No, right? So they sequester these cardiac glycosides, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and they use those toxins as a defense against things that potentially eat them, okay? So they're sending an honest signal, and the idea here, in its most basic form, is that if I'm a bird and I sample a monarch caterpillar and I get sick, I'm gonna remember that crazy pattern, and the next time I encounter something with that crazy pattern, I'm gonna think twice, right? I'm gonna go, right? The next time you see this shirt, you're gonna think twice about coming to a talk, okay? Right, so that's the idea here. Tussock moth caterpillars are also caterpillars that are found on milkweed plants, and you can see they have this same coloration pattern. They have this orange, this yellow, and the black, but in this case, these tussock moth caterpillars, those things on them, those little bristles, they're hard. They're really hard bristles. So if I was a bird and I was gonna try and consume that tussock moth caterpillar, I would have to make it naked first before I was gonna try and eat it. And that's a heck of a lot of work for a tiny little snack size thing, right? It's like how my kids won't peel their own cuties even though the skins practically fall off of those little, citruses. Not like in my day when I had to peel an orange, right? Like it's a whole different kind of experience. Eastern tent caterpillars also have these furry things, and so I was really interested in these two questions, okay? And I wanted a simple system, and so I started to think some more about what are the ways that you can be a caterpillar. Here's another little cryptic caterpillar, right? And so there's another geometrid. These are his back legs, and his front legs are up here, and he's kind of stretched out. Different strategy for how to be a caterpillar. And as I started to think about a simple system, I said, well, when I think about caterpillars, there aren't really that many aposematic caterpillars. Originally, I was going to do some work in the tropics and then didn't wind up doing that. And I actually did most of my field research up here in Massachusetts. And I was like, oh, this is a kind of a simple system. We only have like a handful of really bright, charismatic caterpillars to kind of test these questions with. And the monarch caterpillar was one. So this is how this was my foray into monarchs. Before this, I hadn't really given monarchs much thought. Go for it. So the question is, do the wasps actually eat these big honking caterpillars? And they do. They will basically take chunks of the caterpillar and they'll take a bolus and then they'll carry that bolus back to their nest and then they'll feed that to their developing offspring or the other larvae in the nest.
So it can't take the whole thing at once, basically.
No, it'll chop it up. Yeah, it'll chop it up and it'll take big chunks out of it. No, lots of times, it's rare to see, well, this was the only time I've ever seen something attack something that big, but I have seen on my front porch, we have a lot of wasps that bring caterpillars in, and they like to make these nests in the thatching underneath the chairs. It's fun times when you come and sit at my house. And I don't do anything to prevent this because I find it kind of fascinating. And they're much smaller caterpillars that I've typically seen them carrying. But you're right, this is a big one for them to carry. Okay, so here's our little brown caterpillar, and here was our monarch caterpillar, right? And so this was what captured my imagination. And then I started to think about, well, does it also matter where you are a caterpillar? So if you're a green caterpillar and you're sitting on a brown trunk versus a brown caterpillar sitting on a green leaf, or if you're on the top of the leaf versus the underside of the leaf, or if you're on a leaf that has leaf damage, how do all of these things go into the ways to be a caterpillar, okay? Trust me, I'm getting to the point, and we'll get back to the monarchs. Although we could just do this. Do we want to do, no, okay. So what I decided for my PhD work was that I was gonna really keep it simple, and so it was like kindergarten met PhD. I spent a lot of time, I don't know if you can tell exactly what these are, I spent a lot of time rolling little clay caterpillars, okay? And then I literally placed thousands of clay caterpillars out in the field. That's right, this is what your NSF dollars went to. Let's fund science, okay? So, because I'm here, professional, I'm still here doing all of this. So, spent a lot of time rolling these little clay caterpillars to then see what would come and sample them. And then, oops, wait, oh, I'm gonna do the things eat caterpillar. All right, hold this thought. So here's my little green caterpillar. So then I started to get interested in, well, this aposematic signal that monarchs send, right? It had been suggested when I read the literature, because I didn't know a lot about monarchs at that point, and this was 20 years ago, but it was suggested in the literature that maybe there was a mimicry complex here in Massachusetts that didn't focus on adults, so didn't focus, and don't worry, I'm gonna do the monarch and the viceroy just so we're all good on our basic biology, the kind of real story. But this is really like the Friday night cocktail story, is that there's this potential mimicry with black swallowtail caterpillars. And these are a caterpillar that if you have fennel in your yard, you might have them lay some of these eggs. And so I had read like a paragraph in a paper that was like published in like the 1940s in the thousands of things that I was reading at that point in my life, trying to put together my thesis question on like what was gonna make my mark. And I stumbled upon this thing, and it suggested that maybe black swallowtail caterpillars were in fact a mimic of monarch caterpillars. And I was like, oh, well, that's kind of cool. So let me also ask a question about monarch caterpillars and their survivorship in the field. So in addition to making lots of little green caterpillars, which was relatively straightforward, and lots of little brown caterpillars, which was relatively straightforward, I decided I was also going to make lots of monarch caterpillars, which required me not just rolling little caterpillars, but then sitting there with Tester's paint. I don't even know if Tester's paint is still on the market, but it was like the model airplane paint, painting them, little white caterpillars, with orange and black stripes, okay? So lots of time spent making these caterpillars and putting them out in the field to see then what would sample them. So hold that thought and I'll tell you how we sampled them. Okay, so things eat caterpillars, yay! Okay, so as Chris alluded to, and Doug Talamay's work tells us, is caterpillars are the hamburger of the forest understory and of fields, okay? When birds are breeding, even birds that are seed eaters the rest of the time of year, when they have babies in the nest, they will feed them caterpillars, okay? So anything and everything eats caterpillars, okay? Which means that there's this bumper crop. And so we have things like our little yellowthroat here, we have wasps, and then we have other things like these assassin bug that are eating caterpillars. So things eat caterpillars. So now you're curious, you're like, how did the crazy little clay things, what are we gonna see on them? So not only did I have to make all of these little clay caterpillars, but then I had to like tether them in the field, and then I had to place them in the field, and they were all this big, and then I had to find them again, okay? So you had to put them out, and then you had to come back and find them, okay? So that was like the key. So things eat caterpillars. And so what does it look like? And so this is a little dark, so I don't know if you can see right there. There's a V mark, okay? And so I would tether my caterpillars with clear thread, like a clear, like sewing thread, and tether them to plants in different fun ways, which was also kind of fun. And then I would come back every 2 to 3 days and try to find my caterpillars again. And then I would determine if they had been attacked or not and what had attacked them. So in addition to those V marks, which indicated that a bird had eaten them, they would sometimes be little scrape marks from mandibles, which typically I inferred meant that a wasp had attacked them. And then very rarely, and like a handful of times, there were little like rodent teeth marks. And so some little mouse had climbed up on something and tried to like peel apart my clay caterpillars. And then I had to do all of this at a density that was low enough so that the things that were trying to eat caterpillars didn't learn to avoid my clay caterpillars, okay? So there was also this whole measuring of like what the caterpillars were doing. Okay, so this is how, again, my point is, this is how I got into Monarchs. So, thinking about the ways to be a caterpillar. So let's talk about the caterpillars, because this is really like the stuff that I'm really interested in about the monarch caterpillars, or about monarchs in general. And so the monarch caterpillar, so here we can see, this is the head capsule, and up here at the front you see those kind of like 3 pairs of legs. Those are what we call true legs. And so by true legs, what that means is when that caterpillar goes through metamorphosis, that's what's going to become the legs of the butterfly. Okay? Now when you look at a caterpillar, there are often these fake legs here, right, that they're also gripping onto things as they move around. And then depending on the type of caterpillar, they'll have different pairs or numbers of pairs of those other legs. But those legs don't turn into the actual legs of the butterfly. Over here we can see a caterpillar, and it's in J form, and J form simply means that this guy's getting ready to go through metamorphosis, and so it's hung itself up and it's spun a little silk, and it's hanging there. But what this image also shows us is that on the rump of this caterpillar, so again, this is the head of the caterpillar, and you can see these caterpillars have these antennae, right, and they use those antennae to sense the environment. But then also on their rump, they have these fake antennae, right? And this is another type of strategy. Remember, I was like really into the ways to be a caterpillar at this point in my life, and so I was like, oh, why are we this color? Why do we have these fake antennae? Has everybody held a monarch caterpillar? For the most part. Okay, monarch caterpillars are one of the few caterpillars that you can handle. A, you're not gonna get a rash. B, you're not gonna kill them unless they're first or second instars, and instars are just the earlier stages, because they have a really tough skin. Have you ever been sitting, this is the perfect time of year, where you're sitting outside and like little green caterpillars like rain down on you, and then you try to gently push it away, and all of a sudden there's all sorts of green splat all over your shoulder, because the skin of those caterpillars is not nearly as thick as the skin of our monarch caterpillar. And so part of that is this strategy, because, right, it's screaming, look at me, look at me. Its strategy is it wants a potential predator to detect it. And one of the underlying premises, and we can debate this at the end, of how that aposematism works is through learning. And so that a bird has to sample it and somehow taste it, and then it figures out like, oh, this is not what I want to eat. And so that tough skin will help it avoid that. Okay? Another anti-predator trait that we see in our monarchs are these fake little antennae at the wrong end. So the idea with those is that evolutionarily, if a bird, say, attacks this end of the caterpillar and the caterpillar escapes and survives, it will be less likely to have damaged something super important, right, AKA the main part of the nervous system or the mouth parts, right, in order for it to survive. So that's another kind of anti-predator adaptation. So these are the caterpillars. Now I'm going to tell you something else about these caterpillars. So we see these yellow, black, and orange, white, and black, or yellow, white, and black rings. When you have a long cylindrical animal, we call these rings. So when we're talking about a snake, we call these rings. They go around the body. Stripes go from head to ass, or right, top to bottom, okay? So that's why I'm calling these rings. So it's not a striped caterpillar, it's a ringed caterpillar. And when we look at these rings, there's a recent study that was actually just published about 6 months ago that actually used photos from iNaturalist, and I'll sing the praises of iNaturalist at the end. And what it showed was something that researchers who've been doing lab experiments with monarchs have seen, is that monarchs reared in warmer conditions actually have skinnier black rings on them than monarchs reared in cooler conditions. And so what this new study shows is that when you look at the variation among caterpillars in the wild, that you can map this onto a latitudinal gradient. So you can go from the southern part of the United States to the northern part of the United States, and you see that this pattern holds. And it also holds when you go from low elevation to high elevation, right? And so when we're at low elevation, we tend to be in warmer habitats. When we get to the top of the mountain, not that you find monarchs and milkweed at the top of the mountain, it gets cooler. Okay, so this is another kind of cool variation that we now see in these monarch caterpillars. All right, so monarchs, if we consider them kind of the start of the story, if caterpillars are kind of the start of the story, now of course there has to be an egg, or does there? Which came first? No. So if they're the start of the story, what are they laying their eggs on? And so monarchs are what we refer to as specialists. Now they're specialists in terms of the females are specialists when they oviposit. So the females are specialists when they lay their eggs. And the caterpillars are specialists in that the caterpillars will only eat milkweed plants, okay? Here in Massachusetts, we have about 7 species of quasi-common types of milkweed. I think we actually have a few additional ones that are extremely rare. The milkweed genus Asclepius is named after Asclepios, who was the son of Apollo, and he was the god of medicine, okay? And so that comes into play because when we look at the plants within this genus, the plants are filled with a number of secondary metabolites. And so secondary metabolites are so named because when botanists were first studying plants, they were really concerned with all of the things that were involved in photosynthesis. And so when they were thinking about naming the chemicals within the plants, the things that were integral to the plants being able to reproduce and grow, they considered primary metabolites, or the primary chemicals. And they originally thought all of these other things that were in plants were kind of like pee and poop of plants, and they thought it was just trash, and they called them secondary metabolites. What we know now is that the secondary metabolites are really important in lots of plants, and the secondary metabolites are lots of things that we as humans have harvested for medicinal purposes, okay? And within the milkweeds, the cardiac glycosides, or the cardinalides, are this main group of chemicals that we have used as humans. These are things like that we've derived similar compounds to digitalis, right? Heart meds that we use, okay? And so this tells us the name of this genus. So within this genus of plants, there's about 120 different species of Asclepius plants that are found, okay? And monarchs, right? What was the point? The point was specialists. That's where I started. Just in case we sometimes lose the thread, I try to get back to it. Monarchs are specialists, so the females will oviposit on only milkweed, and the caterpillars only feed on milkweed plants. But then as adult butterflies, we know they feed on lots of different things. So as adult butterflies, they're not considered specialists when they're feeding because they're generalists. Hit me again.
Did you say that, I was trying to take notes.
Yeah, no, you're good.
That they use some of the secondary metabolites for like heart?
Yep, so the cardinalides were, so the question was about the heart meds. And so the cardinalides are the same group of medicines that are now used in modern heart medicines. I'm sure we've actually gotten better heart meds since then, but that first kind of class of heart medicine comes from milkweed plants. Okay, so we have all of these Asclepius. These are some of the different flowers. Down here in the bottom right is our common milkweed, so that's that big fragrant flower. Actually, I saw milkweed last week in the Arnold Arboretum that's about to flower, which is super early. So Suzanne's face is like, what? Which is super early for them to already be flowering. But we have our milkweed plants. Okay, so they're specialists. They're feeding on these milkweed. I just wanted to make sure there was nothing else. Now, one thing about milkweed is that milkweed, in the last, say, 30 years, has become less abundant in the natural environment than it was. So it used to be a really common plant, particularly in agricultural fields. And so this looks like a crowd that could remember when... Not something I get to say in every university classroom, let me just go with. I think we all might have this collective memory of Monsanto and when some of those herbicide-resistant plants first came on the market. One of the things that the result of that was is that once we had these herbicide-resistant plant crops, that meant that farmers were now spraying with herbicides, which was then removing all of the milkweed from in between those crops, which the milkweed was the weed that was growing in and amongst the crops. And so when the farmers started to spray their crops with these herbicides, because now they could, we wound up losing lots of milkweed habitat. And in many of our agricultural areas, we basically lost about 90% of our milkweed populations, okay? So this was kind of like stage one of some of the things that are affecting monarchs. I personally love milkweed because I'm a really bad gardener. So if there is a plant that has weed in its common name, sign me up. I will plant it in my yard because I can potentially keep it alive. I struggle to keep milkweed alive. I really don't have enough sun for it, but that's my philosophy on weeds. So here we can see some common milkweed out in a field. This is down in Sharon, Mass. This is a really old picture now that I think about this. So this was from some of my field research. And what you notice when you start to see milkweed growing in nature, it reproduces two ways. It reproduces sexually with seeds, and so those seeds and the fluff get everywhere, right? But it also sends these underground rhizomes. And these underground rhizomes evenly distribute the plants to a degree throughout the fields. And so when you look at this picture in particular, it's kind of striking how uniform in terms of the distance those milkweeds are from one another. There was another recent paper that came out in the last 18 months that showed that milkweed planted in household gardens, in those household gardens where the milkweed was evenly distributed throughout the backyard and around the perimeter, they had higher monarch recruitment in those yards than places where people tried to get their milkweed to behave, let's say. And so this might just give you some ways to think about your own backyards, right? That yes, planting natives, and I'm gonna advocate for planting natives at the end, is definitely the way to go. But thinking about those arrangements is also significant for thinking about recruitment. Okay, so there we have milkweed. Now when we think about milkweed, milkweed has, I'm gonna talk about three defenses. It has more than this, but it has three main defenses. It has these trichomes, which are hairs. It has latex, which is the white gooey stuff. And then it has these cardiac glycosides. So, monarchs are not the only things that live on milkweed. I'm going to do that again in a minute, so I'm going to skip this one for right now. Let's first talk about trichomes. So when a monarch caterpillar, because the story is about monarchs, it's not about milkweed. Trichomes. I was like, what was my point? Trichomes, so these are these little hairs on the leaf surface. It turns out that the density of trichomes varies, again, as you look at a gradient. So if you go from the southern part of the US to the northern part of the US, milkweed gets hairier as you move north. And the reason it gets hairier is the reason every other organism gets hairier as you move north, because hair serves as a great insulator, right? And so those hairs, as you move further north, serve to help insulate those plants. But what that means for a monarch caterpillar is those hairs are a pain in the tuchus. Just like for the bird trying to eat the tussock moth caterpillar, where those bristles, right, are a cost in terms of an impediment to eating it, these hairs are an impediment to the monarch eating the milkweed plant. So those really little instars, and so if this was zoomed way out, this little caterpillar might be the length of my pinky nail, and I don't have very long nails, right? So really kind of small little caterpillar. The first thing this caterpillar does is it mows the lawn. It comes out and it snips off all of the trichomes, and it doesn't eat them, okay? It just drops those trichomes off of the plant. So there's no it's an energetic cost for this newly hatched caterpillar. It basically has to mow the lawn. Now, the second thing that this poor little caterpillar has to do is it forms a series of trenches. So it goes and it snips all of these lactifers, which are the vessels that hold the latex in the milkweed plant, and it relieves the pressure of the latex in that leaf. So then what it does is then it's like, I was going to say praise the Lord Jesus, but that didn't feel right in the church. I'm okay with that. So then it can then consume, right, this little center disc of the plant. Okay, so it has to do a lot of work in order to get its first meal. Okay, and it's a tiny little caterpillar. Now, the other thing I want you to note about this caterpillar, because this becomes important in a few minutes, is look at the color pattern on that caterpillar. Do you see lots of yellow and white and black? You can see like the hint of it, right? It looks like there's the start of that signal. Now, this becomes important later on, so we'll talk about like the strength of that signal and what it means. So we have trichomes. So the first thing that it has to defeat are the trichomes. Yes, defeats the trichomes, then it defeats the latex, but not every caterpillar is successful, right? So if a gravid female can lay 200 to 300 eggs, it's something like 1% to 2% of those eggs actually make it to the adult stage. So you lose caterpillars all over the place. You lose eggs all over the place, you lose the cats all over the place. Oh, I do sometimes talk about caterpillars as cats. And the first thing I usually tell my students in my conservation biology class is these are the only outdoor cats allowed, okay? The coolest cats and the only outdoor cats. And you can ask me about that after if you want. But here you can see this little caterpillar. It succumbed to that latex. Now, when the caterpillars get older, oh wait, here's the latex. So here you can see me just kind of playing with my milkweed, because that's what we all want to do. Playing with the milkweed, trying to get that latex to come out. You can see there's a big fat juicy cat in the background there, also munching on that plant. And so latex is the second thing that it has to overcome. And when you think about latex, it's sticky. It always, to me, whenever I'm playing with milkweed, feels like somebody has dumped a bucket of Elmer's glue on my hands, right? And then you're like sitting there trying to peel it off, and then you're making it worse, and then it gets dirty, and then it's in your hair, and you're like, how did this latex get everywhere? And so for monarchs, and for anything feeding on milkweed, it's like getting a bucket of paint stuck in their mandibles. Okay, so it's a real challenge, particularly for those smaller instars or those younger caterpillars, to overcome or circumvent that defense. Now, this is also a little bit of new research. So had I given this lecture 5 years ago, I would then tell you this is a late instar caterpillar. So late instar, it's a fourth or a fifth. This actually looks like a fifth instar caterpillar. And when we look at this caterpillar, what's this caterpillar doing? It's actually cutting a trench right here in the main mid-vein of that leaf. And what I would have told you 5 years ago is after it cuts this midrib, it will then proceed to turn itself around, because this is the head, and then it'll move out to the tip of the plant and begin to eat from the tip back in, because it has relieved the pressure in that main vein where all of the latex comes from. It turns out there was a study within the last year that now suggests, and now I'm going to have to admit to never having paid too close attention to this because I just relied on what the literature had told me, that now suggests that the caterpillars will actually stay in this position and that they consume that initial rush of latex before they then move around, because that initial rush of latex actually has a higher cardinalide content than the other latex that comes later. So invite me back in a year and a half and I'll let you know if that conclusion still holds or not. But there's still this there's still something going on with the latex. Our larger instars are in fact able to tolerate it a little bit better, but it turns out that what we thought was this behavior that was sabotaging the latex might actually be a behavior that is exploiting the latex in order to get at those cardiac glycosides. Okay, so let's talk about the cardiac glycosides. So within that latex and within all of the leaf tissue are these cardiac glycosides. And so I've probably already said this because I suspect at this point I have. So when the monarchs are feeding on the milkweed plant, they sequester those cardiac glycosides. And so what sequester simply means is that they take those toxins and they build them up and they store them within their bodies. So when caterpillars poop, who knows the name of caterpillar poop? Not you. No frass fans here? Okay, so caterpillar poop is called frass, okay? And so frass, F-R-A-S-S. And so frass actually doesn't have any of these cardiac glycosides in it. And so there's a faculty member his last name is Agarwal. He is up at Cornell, and he was an undergraduate student where I went to grad school, and he showed up at my PhD defense, and I didn't know he studied monarchs. A little bit intimidating. But he tells this story of him making homemade pizza and putting Monarch frass on the pizza to see what his family would think of it, because all of the secondary compounds have been taken out of the plants. And so he's like, yeah, it's just like you're just eating green, right? It's just like plant matter that has been processed, not at a processing plant, but processed through the caterpillars, but it's perfectly benign. Because the monarchs are in fact sequestering and storing those cardiac glycosides within their tissues. Now these cardiac glycosides are what they then use for their own defense. And it turns out that monarchs aren't the only species that feed on milkweed plants. And so when you go out and you explore milkweed plants, and I 100% encourage you to go play with milkweed, when you explore milkweed plants, what you'll notice is there's lots of things that are brightly colored that live on milkweed plants. And it turns out that many of these organisms are also aposematic in that they're screaming, hey, look at me, aren't I red and aren't I bright? And come sample me because you will never want to eat me again. Okay, now what's the important thing that I wanted to tell you about monarchs? So it turns out that milkweed plants produce different amounts of cardiac glycosides depending on who else has fed on those plants and when they fed on them. So cardiac glycosides are a standing defense in a plant, which means it's always ready to fight, right? It's always got like a little bit of fight in it, but it also can call up the reserves so that when the plant is attacked, it will detect that attack and it will produce more of these cardiac glycosides, okay? This is going to be important. Hold on to this fact. If I was going to quiz you, this would be one of the quiz questions, okay? So you're going to hold on to this. So who feeds and when they feed on the milkweed plants matters. And it matters for the monarch. It matters probably for everybody, but the talk's supposed to be about monarchs. It matters for the monarchs, okay? Because then that means that monarchs are as toxic as the plants that they have fed on. Okay? So while it's always an honest signal, there's nuance in that signal. All right? So that's one thing. Let's see what else. Okay. So the types of cardinalides in the plants also vary. I'm not going to go into this one because I feel like I am lingering a little bit. But which species feeds on which species of plants, so which herbivore feeds on which species of plants, also affects the different types of cardinalides that are produced. So I've been talking about cardinalides as though they were just one thing. Note that they're like a family of things, okay? And so that there's variation in them there too. Okay, why do cardinalides matter? So one of the ways that cardinalides matter is, in addition to things eating monarchs, so there's something like 30 known insect predators or invertebrate predators of monarchs, and there's something like 15 different types of parasites or parasitic species that also prey on monarchs. One of the things that monarchs have gotten in the news quite a bit is over this protist, and it's called OE. And OE, when a monarch butterfly is infected with OE, if the OE load is high enough, it will cause the monarch to not develop fully, okay? But now, just like any other type of infection, lower loads of these spores, monarchs can still kind of do their thing. They will develop, but the females will be sickly. It turns out that females who are sick with OE, they can actually, there's parental care in insects. This is like one of my big wow moments. So when you think about monarch butterflies, there's actually parental care. So females that are sick, okay, so when a female has OE, when she lays her eggs, spores from her abdomen often land on the plant as she is ovipositing. The caterpillars that emerge, then when they go to eat that leaf, will eat those spores and they develop the infection. Okay, so that's how the infection is passed from the female to the offspring. Females that have this OE infection will actually choose to oviposit on on milkweed plants with higher levels of cardinalides, because plants with higher levels of cardinalides actually lower the spore load in that next generation. Okay, so that the females, how the females can, and this is still not known, how ovipositing females detect cardinalide levels, whether it's from a volatile that's released from the plant. Females also do this like little drumming behavior when they go to oviposit. They think maybe there's something in that drumming behavior that they're sampling the plant and detecting the level of cardinalides. But females will choose, and they medicate their children. And so in my book, this is a form of parental care, okay? Which there's not a lot of evidence for a lot of parental care in invertebrates. So this is one. So the cardinalides matter. Why else do cardinalides matter? Well, there's a little bit of climate change confusion. So as temperature rise, it turns out that the spores, the OE spores, actually are breaking down. So OE tends to occur here in Massachusetts late in the season because it kind of, like every other kind of zoonotic disease that we get, it kind of comes up from the south. So it tends to appear here later in the season. In warmer climates, it tends to be maintained at a higher population. So in the southeastern part of the US, there's more OE than there is up here. But it turns out as summers get hotter, those spores are breaking down as the season progresses. So maybe this is like a climate change optimism. Now the counter factor is that in warmer temperature, milkweed plants, it appears that the potency of cardinalides in some species of milkweeds is going down as temperatures warm. So this is why originally I had this in as like a climate change win, and then I was like, oh, Colleen, you forgot about the cardinalides. And I was like, fine, it's confusion. So we have like a climate change confusion moment over these little guys. All right, let's talk about aposematism though, and I'm gonna go in the way back machine to Lincoln Brower. And Lincoln Brower he was a researcher who was out in Western Massachusetts who first gave us the evidence that monarchs were in fact aposematic. And what Brower did was a really simple experiment where he had naive blue jays, so hand-reared blue jays, so they weren't wild caught, but they were reared in the laboratory. And he fed them monarch butterflies. And he fed them monarch butterflies that were reared on 2 different host plants. This is still a mystery to me because I have reared monarchs in a lab setting. At my current university, I don't have a lab, but at my last university, I did. And I could never get a monarch to eat anything but milkweed. But somehow Lincoln Brower reared populations of monarchs, it said, on cabbage. Yes, see, I've never been successful. I tried. I could not get them in a lab to eat cabbage. But what Brower did was he then had these 2 populations of monarch butterflies, one that was sending an honest signal, it was aposematic because it was reared on the milkweed plants, and one that was sending what we call warning coloration. It was still bright orange, but it didn't have these toxic cardinalides. And it turns out that blue jays who sample benign monarchs first will readily keep consuming monarchs because they don't get sick. Blue jays that sample monarchs with cardinalides have a nice little bout of throwing up, okay? So they'll consume the monarch and then they will immediately regurgitate the monarch because of the cardinalides present. If you then subsequently offer the blue jay a monarch butterfly, it's like no way, no how. It's like that one time that you had the bad case of something from some takeout and you've never gone back to that restaurant. That's exactly what the monarch butterflies do. Okay, they learn from this. I'm sorry, the blue jays do. They learn from this. So this was the first piece of evidence that we had, and so Brower did this work in the late 50s, that monarch butterflies were in fact aposematic. We've since confirmed that with chemical analyses of the butterflies. We know that they store the cardinalides. We know that the chemical markers are the cardinalides from the plants. We can do the whole chemical analysis, but this was the first piece of evidence. And so Brower is who gave us the classic story of the monarch butterfly and the viceroy. And so this is the classic story of Batesian mimicry that you probably learned in the 8th grade, where monarch butterflies are the model, and viceroy butterflies, which we also have here in Massachusetts, are the mimic. And viceroy, as the story goes, because wait, there's going to be a big reveal, as the story goes, the viceroys are in fact palatable. Viceroys, you can tell in the field, they have this little band on that hind wing. That's a poor picture, Colleen. But you remember before, our male monarch with balls apparently didn't have that stripe. So that's how you tell them apart in the field. And this is like you still see this in textbooks today. I promise you that if I went into my daughter's high school biology textbook, this would be presented as a case of Batesian mimicry. Okay. Now, remember I told you it's going to be important that we think about this little caterpillar here? Well, one of the things that Brower figured out and that he suggested was, so monarchs then are only as palatable as the milkweed they fed on, or they're only as toxic as the milkweed they fed on, which also means that early instar monarchs, caterpillars, are palatable, and late instars are not. And I've just told you there's this whole spectrum of cardinalides in those plants, depending on who's fed on them. And I don't know if I said this or not, but of those 100 species of milkweed, there's a whole palatable, I did, because we talked about the OE and some species of milkweed having different there's a whole spectrum of cardinalides in the Asclepias genus. So what Brower suggested for us is he suggested this concept of automimicry in that, wait for it, and this hurts my brain and it still does to this point, but remember I spent a lot of time thinking about mimicry and evolution, and at least I'm not going to make you draw the fitness survivorship curves that I make my undergraduates draw, because that really does hurt their brains. But these, right, what Brower suggests is that these early instar monarchs are in fact mimics of late instar caterpillars, in that they harbor the protection that the late instars provide them, in that some adult monarchs that are more palatable than other monarchs are in fact mimics of one another, so that you can have this whole spectrum of mimicry happening within one species, which is a little bit mind-bending, okay? I can tell Kenny's looking at me perplexed, right? It's a little bit, there we go, it's a little bit mind-bending. So that was part one of the story. Part two of this story is that it turns out that if you actually look at, now we know if we go to the tropics and we look at adult Lepidoptera, there's all sorts of complex mimicry chaos going on. You have Batesian mimics and Müllerian mimics, and if none of that sounds familiar, Batesian mimicry is that classic example, toxic model mimic that's benign. Müllerian mimicry is that case where you have two things that are toxic or heinous, mimicking one another, and so they converge upon this same signal, all right? And in the tropics, right, you got all sorts of crazy things happening. It turns out that when you look even here in North America at this simple case of the viceroy mimicking the monarch butterfly, now these two species we have up here in Massachusetts, but monarchs aren't our only species of danid butterfly here in North America. We also have queen butterflies. Oh, you're seeing the pattern, the queen, the monarch, and the viceroy, and at some point I'm gonna have to go to Wikipedia and remind myself, like, what's the viceroy again? But you have the queen, the monarch, and the viceroy. So down, say, in Florida, you have the queen butterfly, which is also a danid. So you see that genus name is the same. And it turns out that if you look at the viceroy, in places where the queen occurs, the viceroys more closely resemble the queen than the viceroys do up here. So there's this variation in the viceroy depending on which model is more prevalent. And it turns out that in the early 2000s, when people started doing chemical analyses of the viceroy, they're actually not as palatable as we think they are, and they're kind of mildly toxic, but not as toxic as a queen or a monarch. And so is this actually just a case of a palatability spectrum and it's all malaria mimicry where they're converged on the same signal and it's not actually Batesian mimicry? Now, the old guard in biology is not willing to give up this as Batesian mimicry just yet. It's going to take another 20 years. But eventually that's what I suspect will happen here. Yep.
Is this when the mimicry, is that something, I'm not sure how it's happening, but is it an evolutionary thing, or is it sort of like a flower that changes pattern to blend in with the surroundings?
So our monarchs, their color patterns are fixed. So the question was it a plastic response, and that's where like you blend in with your surroundings, or was it a fixed response? And in the case of all three of the species of butterfly, they are all orange to some degree. So, but they also have these other coexisting traits of toxicity.
How did they come about? I mean, if you say the ones down there are more like the queen and the other ones are more like the monarch.
So, all right, hold that question till after, because I need to finish more of my monarch story. But I can explain that after. Okay, so let's go back to our monarch caterpillar, because I remember that was how I got into this. And so what did I find when I started to investigate this question of our monarch caterpillars? So it turns out when you make hundreds of clay caterpillars and you put them in all sorts of different places, that you can actually get at some of these questions. So what I did was I put little monarch caterpillars on milkweed, because that's where they should be, right? And then I said, I wonder what happens if, because, I don't know, sometimes monarchs must go off of the milkweed. What if I put a monarch caterpillar on a goldenrod, which I know it can't eat, but let me put one of my little clay models on goldenrod and other things that are in the field. And then, you know, because I was cocky and I was in my 20s, I said, what happens if you put a monarch butterfly or monarch caterpillar on a woody plant in the forest understory? And it turns out that the monarch color pattern is always a good pattern for deterring predation. And so what I mean by that is that very few of my monarch clay models ever got attacked. Almost none of my models got attacked that were on milkweed plants. A few of my models on goldenrod and other herbaceous things got attacked. And then let's say many of my monarch caterpillars in the forest understory got attacked. So what does that suggest? That suggests that birds are freaking smarter than we think they are, right? And that the signal of our monarch caterpillar is probably context dependent, right? And so it's not good enough to just be a monarch caterpillar, but you have to be a monarch caterpillar in the right location. Now, the other thing that I did, because every good scientist has to have a control, and what I just explained to you had no control, I also put green caterpillars on my milkweed plants, and then I put green caterpillars on plants that were in the field, and then I had this whole other experiment going on with my green caterpillars in the forest understory. And it turns out that my green caterpillars on my milkweed plants did almost as well as the monarch caterpillars on milkweed plants, which is totally not what anybody expected. And the reason that probably is because it's context dependent. So remember when I showed you that picture of all of the things that live on milkweed? And they were all bright red and conspicuous? Birds are probably like, dude, I'm not gonna have anything to eat on those milkweed plants, so I'm just gonna stop looking, right? So they don't even forage on those milkweed plants. And because you still need another good control, I remember I had to count all of my caterpillars that were going on in the background to see what was where and who was what, and finding caterpillars was apparently like a full-time job. It turns out that if you go out and you look at milkweed plants and you see who's hanging out on them, there are not a lot of things feeding on them. And that's what the literature, when I say the literature, that's what most scientists are concerned about. They're like, I'm doing my research project and I see that these tetropes are feeding on this, right? And that's what we read about, is all of these things feeding. But if you do surveys, you'll see there's lots of green caterpillars that actually go, particularly to the tops of milkweed plants, to pupate. So they'll kind of get up there and they'll build a little web and then they'll pupate up there. There'll just be green caterpillars hanging out on milkweed plants. There were copious amounts of gray tree frogs, which I still have never figured out, hanging out on milkweed plants in the middle of fields. And what I suspect is that milkweed plants are a predator-free space, and so lots of green things and brown things just come and they're like, oh, I'm taking 5. They're like that mom, with the toddler who is just like, I need 5 minutes to rest. And milkweed plants, because things that forage in fields have decided that milkweed plants don't have a lot of good things feeding on them, don't forage on them. So that was like my little part of this story. And so what that suggests though, that first conclusion where if you move from milkweed to herbaceous things to forest, the signal of the monarch caterpillar still works, it's just not as effective. That does in fact suggest that we could have black swallowtails as mimics of our monarchs. But this is in the caterpillars. And at that point, it was the early 2000s. People weren't really looking at mimicry in caterpillars yet, and so this was kind of a novel thing. Okay, let's get to the rest of some of our monarch mayhem. So the migration map. So we're here in this east coast of monarch butterflies. There's 2 populations here in North America. They're divided by the Rocky Mountains. I'm gonna focus on our East Coast monarchs because the title of the talk was Massachusetts Summer Residents, and there was gonna be no other way to rein me in. But I will also say that monarchs are an invasive species in other parts of the world. So there's populations in New Zealand, there's populations in Australia. So our beloved monarch, right, which is this kind of charismatic species for conservation, is a troublesome chaos creator in other parts of the world, which then is going to create this paradox, right? If our monarchs become endangered in their native range, what does that mean for where they're invasive? So this paradox of endangered invasive species is something that most of the world is dealing with. But let's get to the main point here. And the main point here is that the monarchs that are arriving to us today in Massachusetts are likely members of this second generation of monarch butterflies. And so what I mean by that is to complete the migration, the monarchs that leave Massachusetts in the fall are members of this 4th generation, and this 4th generation of monarch butterflies flies this Herculean distance down into Mexico, and they park themselves in the oil mill firs and the tops of these mountains, and they overwinter. And those monarch butterflies live for anywhere from 6 to 8 months, okay? And then in March, those monarchs come down off the tops of the mountains and they start breeding. And that first generation of butterflies is going to migrate a little bit away from those mountaintops and lay their eggs. And that generation lives only for total from egg to end of its adult lifespan, 2 months. And it completes a part of the migration that's completely different from the migration path that any other generation will complete. That second generation comes up, say, from the southern part of the US, and it joins us here in Massachusetts. And this third generation, right, is kind of moving between, say, New Jersey and Canada to the north. And these are who are with us for the summer. Okay, and that 4th generation gets laid in September, October, and with climate change, I've even found eggs as late as November. Those November monarchs aren't making it anywhere after, they're not making it back to Mexico, but they are out there. This is another way to kind of think about the different generations, but the real takeaway is that it basically requires 4 generations in order to complete the migration. If you start to think about the genome and what must be encoded in the genome, right? First of all, I don't know if I want to be the 4th generation or I don't want to be the 4th generation, because the 4th generation has to migrate, So it has to complete this Herculean migration from, say, anywhere from southern Canada all the way down to Mexico. And then once it's reward, it gets to sit in a refrigerated box in Mexico, basically park itself in these trees at the tops of the mountains and rest. So I'm not sure that actually sounds like much of a life. At first, my students are always like, oh, I want to be the long generation. And I'm like, yeah, but what does the long generation get to do? They get to travel a really long time, and then they get to hang out, literally hang out. And those other generations are much shorter. Now, when that southern migration happens, I just wanted to point out some things that happened for us here in Massachusetts. Up in Rockport, there are a couple of well-known roosts that during the fall migration, Halibut Point State Park is one. You can go up there during fall migration, and a roost is simply where, as the monarchs are migrating, they will aggregate in these central areas and rest for the night. I've also seen mini roosts in Nahant, right by tides, on all of that goldenrod that's right at the end. Don't ever let DCR get rid of that goldenrod that's right by tides. People think it's the sneezy one. Yeah, they think it's ragweed. It's goldenrod. We want to keep that goldenrod there because that's one of these super refueling spots for our monarchs. So our monarchs basically come down the coast. I can remember when my kids were little and they had soccer games out in Nahant, and when they were real little, and you know, it's like painful to watch this. I was counting monarchs as they were going over in the fall. That was the problem with the hockey rink, Margot. There wasn't anything to count as you were sitting there. But look for those roosts. That's another kind of local thing that we do actually. We are still part of that amazing migration. When they overwinter, this is an up close. I have not yet been to Mexico to see the overwintering populations. February break is kind of the time to go if you are thinking about that. But they park themselves in the tops of these trees where it's cool and it's moist. So one of the things with climate change is that as we are losing both the moisture and the coolness in the tops of those mountains, we are seeing some of these populations struggle. Monarch Watch and World Wildlife Foundation, they publish the annual the size of the overwintering sites in Mexico. This year, you might have seen at the end of February that the numbers got released, and we had a dramatic increase in the size of the overwintering ground. It was like over a 100% increase compared to the year before, but as you can tell, the overall trend is this declining trend in terms of the overall area that is inhabited by these overwintering monarchs. So when we start to think about some of the risks, we'll talk about some of the risks, but their overwintering habitat is definitely one of the risks. In terms of what's going on here in North America or in the United States in terms of the Endangered Species Act, in December, it was potentially listed for being considered for being listed on the Endangered Species Act. Comments were opened through the middle of March. I have to say that in the last 2 days, when I was like, oh, I should go see what the status is, our government web pages are clearly not working at present, so there was very little updated information about the status of monarchs and the Endangered Species Act. I tend to fall into that category because of what I just alluded to, that I don't think monarchs are going to go extinct. What's going to go extinct, or what we're at risk of losing, is the phenomena of the migration. We already have populations in the southern part of the United States where we have non-migratory monarchs because of how we've manipulated the habitat. And so what I think is at risk is likely the migratory habit. We may lose monarchs, say, in Massachusetts in the next 50 to 100 years, but because they're already an invasive species in other places, I doubt we will actually globally lose the monarch butterfly. I'm not sure if I'm giving you much optimism there, but when we think overall about what are some of the threats to monarchs, breeding habitat loss, which I alluded to in terms of loss of milkweed, has been kind of the primary culprit, say 30 years ago. Overwintering habitat and deforestation in Mexico then got a lot of bad news, say probably 15 years ago, but there's a lot of protections there now. Climate change is probably our biggest factor at present, both for our summer breeding grounds, how climate change is impacting our milkweed plants, and how it's impacting our overwintering grounds. Pesticides are still at play. The recent literature, so there was a paper that came out in the last 6 months that showed that milkweed, planting milkweed is going to be one of the things I'm going to tell you to do, but milkweed bought at commercial nurseries, they sampled 33 commercial nurseries and detected, even in the pesticide-free milkweed plants, over 61 different types of pesticides still present on the leaves, and that they were persistent on the leaves even after transporting outside of the nursery habitats. So my argument it's going to be, when buying natives, go small, go local. Natural enemies are in fact still a great risk to monarch butterflies. Over here on the left, we have a European paper wasp that was INAT'd by somebody in the audience. I didn't know, that's your observation, yeah. And so there's recent research showing that European paper wasps, that in suburban and urban backyards where people are planting milkweed, that the milkweed is actually potentially serving as an ecological trap, because we now have these invasive European paper wasps that are predating these populations to a higher degree. So an ecological trap is what researchers refer to as when the environmental conditions are changing so quickly that things that used to be a good cue for a species become a problematic cue for a species. And because of this new invasive species, there's now this suggestion that this, to some degree, is in fact an ecological trap. And so that's one of these kinds of examples of an anthropogenic cause. In terms of some of the things that you can do or actions that you can take, you can always, all right, I am a researcher at heart. My other shtick and other talks that people have seen me give is I am a big fan of what's referred to as citizen or participatory science. And I truly believe in the democratization of science, in that science isn't something you need a PhD to do. If I can't prove that to you in any other way, I think the fact that I told you I basically played with clay for my PhD should really illustrate to you that science is accessible and should be accessible to all. I somehow tricked the University of Pennsylvania into giving me a PhD for playing with clay, okay? So science should be accessible. My favorite thing to do is to argue for use of iNaturalist. We don't know exactly how iNaturalist, you don't know how your observation will be used. I alluded to that paper earlier in my talk where researchers went in and they culled the last 5 years of iNaturalist observations. They exported all of those photos that people took. And so it's very opportunistic data, and they were able to show on this latitudinal and elevation gradient that color morphology in those black stripes. So you never know what your iNat data, how it will be used, but iNaturalist is a really kind of easy way, gateway, I call it like your gateway drug to doing science. It's simply taking a photo, recording a sound. It creates species occurrence data and other types of data. eButterfly, if you want to go more hardcore and have a little bit more rigor to your data, eButterfly is the way to go. If you're looking for other butterfly enthusiasts, the Massachusetts Butterfly Club, I am a super fan of, and they keep great data. And if iNat and eButterfly is too tech for you, they use a listserv, except they did finally get to a Google group, and that's how they communicate, and that's how they collect all of their data. And they have quarterly meetings and walks. So those are that's your local source. Monarch Watch and Monarch Larva Monitoring Project are great ways to get involved. Here we can see a tagged monarch butterfly. And so monarch tagging is still going on. Some of it you might be like, but wait, we know where the butterflies go. Why are we still tagging butterflies? Some of the questions that researchers are asking now in terms of tagging butterflies, if we tag a butterfly in Massachusetts and then there's a hurricane in North Carolina, how does the increased frequency in storms due to climate change, how is that impacting the migratory pathways? It's only by volunteers going out and netting butterflies and putting little stickers on them that researchers can start to ask and answer those kinds of questions. So you can get involved in lots of different ways. If you want to take action for monarch butterflies, you can plant habitat. Your first step to planting habitat is to de-lawn, which Chris has already alluded to for us here tonight. Halt the pesticide use, halt the fertilizer use. Again, I think I am preaching to the choir. Plant natives, buy those natives from your local nurseries, your local sources, and not from large nurseries. Consider disturbance regimes, and what I mean by considering disturbance regimes is Mowing is okay, okay? Mowing your monarchs, oh gosh. Mowing your milkweed every now and again is okay. Maybe not all of it at once, but getting it at different stages will help particularly with ovipositing. Lawns that are typically mowed on a 3-week cycle seem to be a sweet spot here in Massachusetts for promoting biodiversity in lawns in terms of enough things flowering and fruiting. That was some research that was probably about 10 years old at this point that came out of UMass Amherst, where a bunch of undergraduates were hired as summer research assistants, and then they got a bunch of, could you imagine? They got a bunch of landowners who were willing to have college students come mow their lawns on different cycles to then measure the biodiversity outcomes, and they landed on this sweet spot of about 3 weeks. Remove your invasives and remove your non-natives. Talamay calls for something like a 60-40 split or a 70-30 split. That data comes from work of one of his graduate students who is Desiree Naranjo, and what her work showed was that nesting chickadees were more successful in fledging offsprings from nests in suburban backyards when the proportion of native plants stayed above about 70% in those backyards. Otherwise, even if there was nesting, many of those nests were in fact failed nests, and those offspring did not in fact pledge. So there's lots of things that you can do in order to support monarchs. Here is our native pollinator garden that is down at Town Hall. It's not just about planting milkweed, but it's also about planting nectar sources and nectar resources. Those disturbance regimes, are important because females, when they're ovipositing, I stressed in today's talk mainly thinking about different species, but there's actually different height preferences and different age preferences on the milkweed plants. So younger milkweed tends to be favored more than older milkweed. It has to do more with the water content than the actual age of the plant. So cutting it back every now and again will get that done. I will end there. I'm happy to answer any questions. I did go slightly over. I told you I can like fill a vacuum, but hit me.
Yeah, I'm wondering, you said that you're starting to see monarch butterflies, but my milkweed is just starting to grow, so what are they taking?
So they're adult monarchs, and so the adult monarchs are busy nectaring. So we have lots of spring flowers that are in bloom at present. So breeding probably will happen imminently, and then those gravid females will begin to lay their eggs. But I already saw on iNaturalist at least one egg being laid. So they are laying eggs. My milkweed is probably like this big right now. So they're out there and they're getting there. They'll find it. The females will hold on to those eggs until they find a suitable place. And then they will do an egg dump, but they will hold on to them as long as they can. Yeah?
Two things, we do have a native plant pollinator garden here that I believe you designed the original.
I believe Miss Suzanne designed that for us. Yes.
So we're doing the best we can.
Yeah.
Of that.
Much appreciated.
And can I go to the Times and look for these roosting monarchs? Is that monarchs?
I'm going to say late September, early October. They don't form a roost. I don't want to totally deceive you. They don't form a roost there, but I've definitely seen aggregations of monarchs in those goldenrod. The roosts definitely occur up at Halibut Point, up in Cape Ann. And if you Google the Cape Ann roost, there's a nature filmmaker who actually just made a movie about it about a year ago. I can't think of her name. It's Kim something.
I was just going to say, there was a time, maybe it was September, mid-late September, beautiful day, so I'd sit outside and read my book, and literally there were hundreds of monarchs going past my house. I live right off of, down at the beach. So they do come through. It was like amazing. I didn't think they congregated like that. But
Yeah, no, they do. I've definitely seen them land on the goldenrod, and I have seen them at Phillips Beach in September land on the sand, and they'll do like that salting thing, like where they're clearly just resting.
yeah, they just passed them through, a couple of them stopped, but they were
Yeah,
definitely not.
very cool.
It was amazing. So they're around.
Because the water plant in Ohio, they fly over Lake Erie, and then there's actually a little park in Cleveland that they land.
Oh yeah, that's definitely why they're hitting Nahant and why they're hitting Cape Ann, because they're coming down the coast, and then these are little pieces of land that stick out. It's also like with bird migration, that's why these are birding hotspots, because the birds, they drop out, they get tired, and they're like, oh, thank God there's something there, right? The Nahant Thicket, I don't know if you've been to the Nahant Thicket, it's like, there's no good plant in the Nahant Thicket, but, right, am I wrong? There's nothing. But it's a resting spot, and so it's like this dense bramble, but like every warbler that's heading north and heading south seems to like take a little pit stop in the Nahant Thicket because it's sticking out into the water, and it's this one little kind of green space. And so I think the same holds for those goldenrods too. Yeah?
Difference between the third generation and the fourth generation as far as like physically or like DNA or anything? What allows the fourth generation to fly so far compared to the third and second generation?
So physiologically, they're essentially the same. The migrating population is able to hold additional fat stores that helps it to complete that migration. The DNA is the same. So actually within monarchs, this is actually a reason to also maybe celebrate in our monarchs. When they've done genetic analyses of North American monarchs, it turns out that both the Western population and the Eastern population are essentially a single population, despite the fact that the Rocky Mountains have isolated those two populations, so you wouldn't expect that. So what that means for conservation is, unlike other species, where you sometimes get into trouble, say, moving individuals from one geographic area to another geographic area, we suspect that with monarchs, because the gene pool is essentially the same for the North American population, that anywhere you can elevate the population is going to support all of the population. In terms of who migrates and why they migrate, the genetic code basically gets interpreted differently based on the environmental conditions as to like, am I a member of the generation that is short-lived versus the generation that is long-lived? There's different amounts of hormones that are produced depending on the time of year that the monarchs are, the eggs are laid. But when researchers simulate changing abiotic conditions in lab environments, they can elicit those responses in a single population. So there's nothing genetically different about the generations per se. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
But I mean, it's such a long way.
Yeah.
Right? So, and the wind and the sea currents go the other way, right? They go up
Yeah.
the coast. So is the wind helping them? I mean, is there a
So they definitely,
wind or something that's helping them go south?
so they definitely do what birds do in that they will ride the winds. And then within monarchs, there's actually 2 circadian clocks. I may be drifting too far, so just stop me if I am. So Suzanne's just laughing. So there's 2 circadian clocks. So there's a circadian, so the circadian clock is like the thing that tells us all, right, like when to go to sleep and when to stay awake, right? And clocks are entrained or can be free running. And so with monarchs, sorry, this is also me simulating. So there's one clock that's in the antenna, and then there's one clock that's in the eye. And so somehow the 2 clocks perceive the sunlight, and they also polarized light and UV light, and they interpret that, and the 2 clocks then send signals to the equivalent of the central nervous system of the monarch, and that's what tells them when it's time to migrate. And so so there's actually a researcher at UMass Lowell, I can't think of his name right now, so at the medical school who's been studying monarch populations for like the last 20 years, mainly doing this circadian clock stuff. And he's the one that's figured out the UV light and the polarized light. So monarchs, unlike birds, also do a lot of migrating even when it's cloudy. Like they don't just it's not just like a warm sunny day when they migrate. Like they can migrate because they're using the polarized light even when it's cloudy, because they can still pick up those cues in the horizon. And this is where I'm not a physicist. The biologist can only hold on to so much. Yeah?
A few weeks ago, there was a piece on 60 Minutes with Anderson Cooper
Oh, was it on Monarchs?
Monarchs, New Mexico.
Oh, very cool. I have not seen it. Okay.
The western monarchs and the eastern monarchs all go to the same place in Mexico?
No, so I actually ignored the western monarchs. The western monarchs do a shorter migration, and they basically migrate down to the coast and inland. So they go up and down, and they mainly overwinter, I think at this point, in eucalyptus, which is an introduced species in western Mass. But that's where I think they do most of their overwintering. And so that's a smaller, shorter migration. And so Danid butterflies, like in terms of like why they migrate, one of the hypotheses about their migration is Danid butterflies are essentially a neotropical group of butterflies. And so most of the species that are Danid butterflies are actually found in Central and South America. And what they suspect happened was that during the last glaciation, and there are many short distance migratory species of Danid butterflies. Okay, so like this upland or this up elevation and down elevation migration is probably more typical within that group of butterflies. And so what evolutionary biologists hypothesized happened was that during the last glaciation, that as milkweed plants expanded with glacial retreat and kind of moved north, that the mutant butterfly that could migrate a little bit further to exploit that milkweed was more successful. And that is what then led to this long distance migratory version of a Danid butterfly. Cheryl?
Are the butterflies are they toxic to people as well? I mean, I saw the guy handling it without gloves or anything. Can they?
I wouldn't eat them. Because cardinalides,
A recipe in mind.
cardinalides are generally toxic to mammals in high concentrations. So if you ever look at a field, I had that slide in there and I took it out. I have a picture of a field where there's horse grazing behind a fence and then there's no horses grazing outside the fence. And inside the fence where the horses live, the milkweed is the only thing left, because the horses don't eat, because they too get sick from the cardinalides in it. But yes, you can generally handle a monarch butterfly, and unlike other butterflies, you can touch them, and that picture was of Suzanne holding that monarch. Their scales, yeah, their scales don't come off because they're such a long distance migratory species that they're tougher than most butterflies. So both the caterpillars are tougher because they need to be sampled. The adults are also tougher. So like when the adult butterfly gets sampled, you'll see tired monarchs in the field, like say in August, and they'll be like clear V marks out of their wings, and some bird has tried them and it was like, ugh, forget that, and moved on to something else. So like they can handle a little bit of handling, unlike say like a swallowtail. If you ever find like a swallowtail, I remember my kids one time we went camping and they found a dead swallowtail and they carried it back to me, and by the time they got back, there were just scales all over their fingers. But because they had this experience with monarch butterflies, they didn't understand that that butterfly was going to disintegrate as they tried to carry it. And so like they were confused and befuddled. Like the thing was already dead, so it was okay. But like they were confused and befuddled by the fact that all of the scales had shed onto their skin. And I was like, oh yeah, you generally can't handle butterflies. I guess I haven't taught you that lesson. I've just taught you that you can pick butterflies up and play with them. So I'm going to end the formal part of this and turn off my microphone, but I'm happy to keep answering questions. But I feel like we need an end point for Chris. Does that sound like a plan?